The community center piano was old. Everyone knew it. It had a chipped key on the high end, the F sharp, and a faint musty smell of dust and old wood that clung to it. In the afternoon, when the sunlight slanted through the big, streaky windows, you could see dust motes dancing above its scuffed brown lid. It was Thursday, which meant the after-school program was in full swing. The air buzzed with the sound of bouncing basketballs from the gym down the hall, the sharp squeak of sneakers. And the laughing shouts of kids finally set free Dot in a smaller room off the main hall. A different kind of energy hummed. A dozen kids, some fidgeting, some sitting up straight with serious faces, were arranged in a semicircle around the piano. They were here for the special workshop. A visiting artist. A big deal. In the back corner, sitting so still he almost seemed part of the furniture, was a boy. He was 10, maybe 11, with dark, careful hands folded in his lap. His name was Elijah. He wore a simple blue t-shirt and jeans, and his sneakers were clean but well worn. His eyes, a warm brown, were open and calm, but they didn't track the basketball flying past the door or the way the dust motes swirled. Elijah was blind. He knew this room better than anyone who could see. He knew the exact number of steps from the doorway to the chair he now sat in 17. He knew which floorboard by the bookshelf creaked if you stepped on its left side. He knew the scent of the old paper in the books, the tongue of lemon-scented cleaning spray that arrived every evening at 5, and the unique, slightly oily smell of the piano's aged keys. He knew it all because his grandmother cleaned this building. 6 nights a week, after the last staff member left, she would push her cart of supplies through the quiet halls, and Elijah would be with her, his small hand resting on the cart's handle. His grandmother was his rock, his compass. She had raised him since he was a baby, and her voice was his favorite sound in the world, warm and deep, like molasses. She worked hard, her hands rough from cleaning, but they were always gentle when they guided him. Those nights in the empty community center were their secret time. When her work was done, she would sometimes lead him to the piano room. "Go on, baby," she'd say. "Say hello to the old friend." She'd lift the heavy fallboard, and his fingers would find the keys. He never played songs, not any you'd know. He'd press a key and listen to the note fade into the silence of the big, dark room. He'd find chords, clusters of sounds that felt happy or sad, or like the steady drum of rain on the roof. He had memorized the entire landscape of the keyboard by touch. That chipped F-sharp was a landmark under his fingertip. The slight stickiness of the middle C from spilled juice long ago was another. The piano, to him, wasn't an instrument for performing. It was a place to visit, a friend who spoke his language. Today was different. Today the room was full of people, full of their rustling and whispering, and the smell of their different shampoos and perfumes. Elijah listened intently, sorting the sounds. He heard Mrs. Jenkins, the program director, her voice always a little tight with worry. He heard the nervous tap-tap of a boy's foot beside him. And then a new voice entered the mix. This voice was different. It was a man's voice, older, with a smooth, polished tone. It didn't belong to the neighborhood. It carried a kind of quiet authority that made the other noises hush. This was Arthur Leyland, the renowned pianist. Elijah's grandmother had told him about it. "A real famous piano man is coming, Eli. You should listen good. Might learn something." So Elijah listened. He heard Mr. Leyland talk about scales, about practice, about the great composers. He played snippets of music-bright, complicated runs that cascaded like water. The notes were perfect, each one clear and precise. Elijah's head tilted slightly, like a satellite dish tuning a signal. He could hear the incredible skill, the years of work in every note. But to him, the music sounded cold. It was like looking at a perfectly drawn map instead of walking through the forest. It was all correct, But where was the smell of the pine? Where was the feel of the mud underfoot? The workshop went on. Mr. Leyland was kind, patient. He helped a girl place her fingers correctly for a C major chord. He encouraged a boy who was struggling with the rhythm. Elijah just sat, a quiet observer in the corner. He wasn't on the list for the workshop. He was just here with his grandmother, who was starting her early cleaning in the office's next door. As the session was winding down, Mrs. Jenkins, probably wanting to be inclusive, pointed Elijah out. "Oh, and we have another young listener here. Elijah loves to be near the piano, don't you, sweetie?" Elijah felt the attention shift to him. He gave a small, polite nod in the direction of her voice. Arthur Leyland looked over. He saw a small, blind boy sitting alone. A wave of kindly, professional pity washed over him. He had seen many children, many eager faces. This boy, so quiet on the sidelines, probably just liked the vibrations of the sound. He decided to offer a moment of encouragement, a gesture of inclusion before he packed up his sheet music. "Well, hello there, Elijah," Mr. Leyland said, his voice warm but distant, the way an adult talks to a very young child. "Did you enjoy the music?" "Yes, sir," Elijah said softly, his voice clear. "Would you like to come and try the piano?" Arthur asked. It was the same offer he'd made 100 times at fancy schools and community centers. A chance for a child to make a little noise, to feel included. Just for fun. No pressure. There was a gentle, expectant silence in the room. The other kids watched. Mrs. Jenkins smiled a tight, hopeful smile. Elijah hesitated for a second. He didn't like being the center of attention, but he also loved the piano. And his grandmother had said to be polite. He stood up, his hand brushing the chair to orient himself, and then walked with surprising, confident grace the 17 steps to the piano bench. He didn't need guidance. He found the bench's edge with his leg and sat down. Arthur Leyland watched, a little surprised by the boy's sure movements. He stood back, giving him space, preparing for the usual clumsy, enthusiastic banging of keys. That Elijah lifted his hands. He let his fingers hover for a second above the familiar landscape. He found the chipped F sharp with the pinky of his left hand, orienting himself. He took a slow, quiet breath. This wasn't the quiet, empty room he knew. This was different. The air was thick with waiting. Then his right hand descended, not onto a single key, but flowing across a sequence of them. It wasn't a bang. It was a fluid, beautiful, melancholic blues scale, starting low and winding its way up the keyboard with a rhythm that was innate, natural. The notes were sure and distinct, each one ringing with a feeling that seemed too old for his small frame. The polite, expectant air in the room shattered. Arthur Leyland's professionally kind expression froze, then melted into pure, unguarded shock. His eyebrows shot up. He took an involuntary step closer. This wasn't random. This wasn't just for fun. This was music. Real, heartfelt, instinctive music. Elijah, having finished the scale, let his left hand join in. He built a simple rolling chord progression, something that sounded like a lonely train at night. He wasn't playing a song he'd been taught. He was playing a feeling. The feeling of sitting in this very room, waiting, listening to the world he couldn't see. He stopped after a moment, his hands returning to his lap. The final note hung in the utterly silent room. The squeaking from the gym down the hall seemed miles away. Arthur Leyland found he couldn't speak. The words "just for fun" stuck in his throat, now casting like ash. He stared at the small boy on the bench, who was now turning his head slightly, as if listening for a reaction. In that silence, something monumental shifted. The renowned pianist, who had come to teach, realized with a jolt that he was in the presence of something he didn't understand. Something raw, real, and extraordinary. The workshop was over. Something else had just begun. The silence in the piano room was thick and heavy, like the air before a summer storm. It wasn't an empty silence. It was full of shock, of a question hanging there that nobody knew how to ask. The other kids just stared, their mouths slightly open. Mrs. Jenkins had her hand over her chest, as if her heart had jumped. But the most profound change was on the face of Arthur Leyland Dott. All the polite, polished calm was gone. His eyes, a pale blue, were wide and fixed on the small boy sitting at the old upright piano. For a man who had heard thousands of prodigies, who had sat in grand concert halls from New York to Paris, this was entirely new. This wasn't practiced perfection. This was something that seemed to come from a deeper place, a well he didn't know existed. The boy hadn't played a piece. He had spoken a sentence in a language made of pure feeling. Elijah, sensing the shift in the room's energy, grew still. His shoulders tightened a little. He was used to sounds loud, soft, happy, angry. This complete quiet was unsettling. He thought maybe he had done something wrong. Maybe the just for fun meant you weren't supposed to play real notes. His fingers, which had felt so sure a moment ago, now curled softly into his palms. Arthur finally moved. He didn't clap. He didn't exclaim. He simply walked over, his expensive leather shoes making a soft, deliberate sound on the linoleum floor. He pulled a chair close to the bench, but not too close. He sat down slowly, his eyes never leaving Elijah's face. "Elijah," he said, and his voice was different now. The polished, visiting artist tone was gone. It was quieter, more careful, like he was approaching a rare bird that might fly away. That was very good. Elijah gave a small, uncertain nod. "Thank you, sir. Who taught you that?" Arthur asked gently. The blues scale you played?" Elijah's brow furrowed slightly. "The what, sir?" "The pattern of notes. Your right hand. Who showed you that?" "Oh," Elijah said, his face clearing. "Nobody showed me. I heard it once. On Mr. Ray's radio. When my grandmother was cleaning the barber shop. It felt good in my hands. Like a ladder going up, but a sad ladder." Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. It felt good in my hands. He had spent decades thinking about theory, about technique, about the historical context of every phrase. This boy thought about how music felt in his hands. Can you do it again?" Arthur heard himself ask. Elijah hesitated. Then he shrugged his small shoulders. He turned back to the piano, his hands lifting. He played the scale again, but this time he let it wander, bending a note here, adding a little trill there, making it sound even more like a lonely singing voice. It was pure, instinctive improvisation. Arthur watched the boy's hands. They weren't in a perfect classical position. They were flat and open, feeling their way, yet they landed on the right notes with an uncanny accuracy. It was as if the piano were an extension of his own body. When Elijah finished, Arthur had to know more. "What else can you play, Elijah? Do you know any songs? Chopsticks? Twinkle, Twinkle?" A small smile touched Elijah's lips. It was the first time he had smiled since sitting down. "I don't know those," he said. Then he added, "But I know what the rain on the fire escape sounds like." Arthur blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Outside the kitchen window," Elijah explained, his voice gaining a hint of confidence. "At my grandma's apartment. When it rains, it hits the metal stairs all different ways. The big drops on the flat part go plunk. The little ones on the rail go ping. And when it gets heavy, it's like a rushing curtain." He turned his head toward Arthur, his empty eyes somehow earnest. "Would you like to hear it?" Arthur could only nod, then realizing the boy couldn't see, He whispered, "Yes, please." Elijah took a deep breath, settling himself on the bench. His expression changed. He wasn't a shy boy in a community center anymore. He was a listener, a translator. His left hand went low on the keyboard, pressing a cluster of deep, muted notes. A low, rolling thunder. Then, with his right hand, he began. What came out was not a melody you could hum. It was a picture. High, sharp, single notes, ping, 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 like the first drops. Then a softer, quicker pattern with his fingers splayed. Pitter, patter, patter. He used the sustain pedal with his foot to let the sounds blur and wash together, creating that rushing curtain. He found a discordant, ringing note high up the sound of water, hitting a specific loose piece of metal. It was chaotic, but it was a perfect, organized chaos. It was unmistakably rain on a fire escape. Arthur Leyland felt the hairs on his arms stand up. He closed his eyes, and he heard it. Not just notes, but the scene. The damp air, the gray afternoon light, the rhythmic, comforting pattern of a storm. This child wasn't playing the piano. He was using it to paint with sound. He had a perfect auditory memory, a synesthetic gift where the world was a symphony of noises waiting to be recreated. The other kids in the room were completely captivated. One girl had her chin in her hands, just watching Elijah's flying fingers. A boy had stopped fidgeting entirely. When the last drop faded, Elijah let his hands fall into his lap again. The room was silent once more, but this was a different silence, all-filled, tender. Arthur found his voice was rough. How did you learn to do that? Elijah thought about it. I don't know. I just listen, and then my hands find it. My grandma says I've been doing it since I was little. I used to tap on her pots with spoons to sound like the washing machine. Just then, the door to the room pushed open. Elijah's grandmother stood there, her cleaning cart behind her. She was a tall, strong-looking woman with kind eyes and hair tied back in a neat scarf. She took in the scene, the famous pianist sitting stunned next to her grandson, the quiet, watching children. A flicker of worry crossed her face. She'd seen people be curious about Elijah before. She'd seen them treat him like a novelty. Eli? Baby, you bothering these folks? She asked, her voice warm but firm. No, ma'am, Arthur said quickly, standing up. Not at all, Mrs. Williams, she said, coming into the room. She put a protective hand on Elijah's shoulder. Is everything all right? More than all right, Arthur said, and the passion in his own voice surprised him. Mrs. Williams, your grandson. He has an extraordinary gift. I have never heard anything like it. Elijah's grandmother looked down at Elijah, who was now leaning back against her. She saw the relaxed pride on his face. She knew that look. It was the look he got when he'd shared his music and it had been accepted. Her wary expression softened, but only a little. He's got a good ear, she said simply, not wanting to make a big fuss. It's more than a good ear, Arthur insisted, trying to keep his voice calm. This is a profound musical intelligence. The way he translates sound. It's genius. Pure, untrained genius. The word untrained hung in the air. Arthur heard it as a tragedy, a raw diamond. Elijah's grandmother heard it differently. To her, untrained meant unspoiled. It meant her Eli was still her Eli, not someone else's project. He enjoys it, she said, her tone making it clear this was a private family matter. Arthur saw the wall go up. He was a stranger, an outsider from a different world. He took a step back, physically and emotionally. He couldn't just barge in. He looked from the wise, tired face of the grandmother to the peaceful, talented face of the boy. He thought of his own sterile, pressure-filled concerts, the critics with their sharp pens, the endless, lonely hours of practice. He made a decision right then. He wouldn't grab. He wouldn't demand ... double quotes, Mrs. Williams, he said, his voice respectful. I don't mean to overstep, but what Elijah can do, it shouldn't be locked in this room. He doesn't need to be fixed. He doesn't need pity. What he has is a light. And he paused, searching for the right words, words that were true. I have spent my whole life studying light, but I think I've been looking at it through a dusty window. He sees it pure. If you would allow it, I would be honored to come and listen sometime. Maybe even show him a few things on the piano, if he'd like. No strings, just music. He wasn't offering a scholarship or a competition. He was offering to sit on the bench. It was the only offer he realized that had any chance at being accepted. Elijah looked up, his face turning toward his grandmother's. He didn't say anything, but his head tilted in a question. His grandmother looked into Arthur's eyes. She was a woman who had met many kinds of people, and she was good at reading them. She saw the shock had faded, replaced by a sincere, almost hungry curiosity. She saw respect, not just excitement. She looked at Elijah's eager, listening face. She thought of the pots and pans, the fire escape rain, the old community center piano that was his best friend. Maybe, just maybe, this man could be a bridge to a bigger world for Elijah, without taking the soul out of his song. She gave a slow, careful nod. We can talk about it, she said. No promises. But we can talk. For Arthur Leyland, it felt like the first truly good thing he'd done in years. For Elijah, it was the feeling of a new door, one he'd heard the hinges of but never walked through, cracking quietly open. The workshop had ended an hour ago. Now, something much more important was just beginning. The following week, the old community center piano felt different. It wasn't just Elijah in the quiet, empty dark anymore. Now, there was a new presence in the room, a careful and focused energy that sat beside him on the bench. Arthur Leyland had come back, just like he said he would. He didn't wear a fancy suit this time, just a simple sweater. He carried a small bag, not a briefcase. Elijah's grandmother had agreed to a trial. One lesson. She sat in a folding chair by the door, her hands folded in her lap, watching like a hawk. She had made her terms clear to Mr. Leyland. This was not a business arrangement. There would be no talk of managers or recordings or concerts. This was about learning, pure and simple. If Elijah ever said he didn't want to do it, it would stop. Arthur had agreed without hesitation. The first lesson was a strange dance. Arthur, used to directing students with precise instructions, found himself unsure where to begin. How do you teach someone who already speaks the language of music in a way you don't fully understand? So Elijah, Arthur started, his voice gentle. You play by ear. You feel it. That's a wonderful, wonderful gift. But sometimes, knowing the names of things, the structure, it can give you more colors for your paint box. Would you like to know the names of the notes you're playing? Elijah nodded, his face serious. Yes, sir. Arthur took the boy's right hand and guided his index finger to press down middle C. The note rang out. This is middle C, Arthur said. It's like home base, the center of everything. Elijah nodded again, his fingers exploring the area around the key. It feels like the starting place, he said, and so it began. Arthur taught him the names of the notes, the scales, the basic chords, a minor, G major, F major. He explained them not just as theory, but as feelings. This chord, he said, playing a bright C major, is like sunlight on your face in the morning. Then he played a darker, more complex one. This is like that moment right before the sun goes down, when the shadows get long and blue. Elijah listened, absorbing everything. He would play a scale, and then immediately twist it into a little melody, making the sunshine chord sound a little sad, or the sunset chord have a hint of hope. Arthur watched, fascinated. The boy wasn't just memorizing. He was tasting each new idea, turning it over in his mind, and then making it his own. About halfway through the hour, Elijah surprised him. "Can I show you something?" the boy asked. "Of course," Arthur said. Elijah turned on the bench, his body angled toward Arthur. "Play something for me, anything, just a little bit." Arthur was taken aback. Students didn't usually ask him to play during a lesson. He played a short, elegant phrase from a Mozart sonata line, precise and beautiful. When he finished, Elijah was quiet for a long moment, his head cocked. Then his small hands went to the keys. What came out wasn't a perfect copy. It was the ghost of the Mozart phrase, but filtered through Elijah's world. The notes were mostly right, but the feeling was entirely different. Elijah added a slight hesitation, a rubato that made it sound lonely and questioning. He ended the phrase with a soft, unresolved note that hung in the air, begging for an answer Arthur's perfect version hadn't even known was missing. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. The boy had not only heard the notes, he had heard the space between them. He had heard the unasked question in Arthur's own playing, a question Arthur himself had stopped listening to years ago. That's not what I played," Arthur finally managed to say. "You played the notes on the page," Elijah said simply, not understanding the weight of his own words. "I played the song inside them." The lesson ended with Elijah learning a simple 12-bar blues pattern. Arthur showed him the structure, the predictable chord progression. Elijah learned it in minutes. Then, as his grandmother stood up to signal time was over, Elijah began to improvise over the pattern. He made the old, slightly out-of-tune piano sing with a soulful, crying sound that seemed to come from another time and place. It was the sound of the neighborhood, of long bus rides and summer nights through an open window. Arthur packed his small bag in a daze. He walked out into the cool evening air, but he didn't head for his car. He walked for blocks, the sound of Elijah's blues echoing in his head. He thought of his own upcoming concert, a program of technically demanding modern pieces he had played 100 times. Suddenly, the thought of walking out on that brightly lit stage felt empty, like serving a beautifully decorated cake that had no flavor out the next week. The dance in the piano room changed. Arthur arrived with a new energy. He taught Elijah more about dynamics, playing loud and soft, about tempo. But he also started asking questions. "Elijah," he said one afternoon, "the washing machine at your home, what does its spin cycle sound like on the piano?" Elijah's face lit up with a grin. He launched into a frantic, rumbling low note with a rhythmic, whirring pattern in the treble that was so perfectly a washing machine, Arthur burst out laughing. It was the first real, unguarded laugh Elijah had heard from him. Then Arthur tried something. Play the color red. Elijah's smile faded. He thought hard. His hands hovered. Then he played a single, strong, furious chord jarring, brilliant clash of notes. It was hot and immediate and impossible to ignore. It wasn't a pretty sound, but it was undeniably red. Arthur stared at the keys. "How did you do that?" "I don't know," Elijah said, shrugging. "Red isn't a quiet color. It's like an alarm, or my grandma's best dress. It demands you listen." In that moment, Arthur Leyland, the world-renowned pianist, understood he was no longer just the teacher. He was also, profoundly, the student. This boy was reteaching him the alphabet of music, a language he had spent his life mastering, but had somehow forgotten how to speak from the heart. One evening, after a lesson where Elijah had perfectly played a Bach minuet and then instantly transformed it into what Bach might hear if he walked down our street, Arthur didn't leave. He waited until Elijah's grandmother finished her work. "Can I walk with you?" he asked her, his voice humble. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. The three of them walked toward their apartment building, Elijah between them, his hand on his grandmother's elbow. "Mrs. Williams," Arthur began, choosing his words with care under the dim streetlights. "What Elijah is doing, it's changing me. I came here to give him tools, but he's giving me a new pair of ears." She listened, her steps slow and measured. "I have a concert next month," Arthur continued. "I've been practicing for it for a year. But now, when I play the pieces, they feel dead, like museum pieces. I play all the notes, but the life he finds in just a few chords, I've lost that." Elijah's grandmother stopped walking. She turned to face him. "What are you saying, Mr. Leyland?" "I'm saying," Arthur said, the confession hurting and freeing him at the same time, "that I need his help. Not as a teacher for him, but would you allow him to be a teacher for me? Would he listen to me practice? Just listen and tell me what he hears? Not the notes. The other stuff. The story." There was a long silence. Elijah stood quietly, feeling the tension between the two adults, not fully understanding it. His grandmother looked down at her grandson's face, so open and trusting. She looked back at Arthur, at the desperate sincerity in his eyes. This was not a man trying to exploit a talent. This was a man who was lost, and who thought her boy might have a map. She let out a long, slow breath. "You can come to the apartment," she said finally. "Saturday afternoons. You can play for him there. But you play for him, not for practice. You play to tell him a story, and he'll tell you back what he heard." Arthur felt a wave of relief so strong it almost buckled his knees. "Thank you," he whispered. That Saturday, Arthur Leyland climbed the narrow stairs to their small, clean apartment. He sat at their modest electric keyboard, a world away from his own grand piano. And he played for an audience of two. He played a piece from his concert, a difficult, stormy modern composition. When he finished, his hands trembling slightly, he turned to Elijah, who was sitting on the sofa, his head leaning against his grandmother's shoulder. "What did you hear, Eli?" Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elijah was quiet for a full minute. "I heard a man in a big, empty house," he said slowly. "He's running from room to room, looking out all the windows. But he's all alone. And he's not really looking for someone outside. He's trying to find a room that feels like home inside the house. But all the doors are locked." Tears welled up in Arthur Leyland's eyes. He looked away, out the small apartment window at the fire escape. The boy had just described, with terrifying accuracy, the last 20 years of his life. The fame, the stages, the empty hotel rooms, the locked doors inside himself. He didn't say a word. He just turned back to the keyboard, and he began to play again. This time, he wasn't playing the notes on the page. He was trying, clumsily at first, to play the feeling of a door unlocking. The Saturday sessions at the small apartment became a quiet ritual. Arthur Leyland would arrive, always with a small treat, a bag of the specific cinnamon candies Elijah liked, or a new fruit for him to taste and describe. He'd sit at the electric keyboard, an instrument that felt toy-like under his practiced hands, and he would play. But it wasn't practice anymore. It was conversation. He played his concert pieces, and Elijah would dissect them like a curious, gentle surgeon. "That part is all glass and sharp corners," the boy might say. "Why is the man in the song so angry at the windows?" Or, "I like the sad river you made in the middle, but it feels like you built a bridge over it too fast. The river wants to be crossed slower, maybe on stepping stones." Arthur would listen, and something in his chest would loosen. For years, critics had used words like flawless, brilliant technical mastery. Nobody had ever talked about the lonely man in the song or the sad river. They heard the notes, not the story. Elijah heard only the story, and the notes were just the words he used to tell it. Arthur began to change. He started improvising during these sessions, something he hadn't done since he was a child. He'd play a melody and ask, "Where does this want to go, Eli?" Elijah, sitting cross-legged on the floor, would tilt his head. "It wants to go upstairs. It's curious, but it's scared of the dark hallway at the top." And Arthur would try to build the staircase in music, and the dark hallway and maybe a sliver of light under a door got in turn. Arthur's formal lessons for Elijah at the community center grew richer. He introduced him to the giants, the deep, rumbling sorrow of a bluesman like Lead Belly, which Elijah understood instantly, and the complex mathematical beauty of Batch, which fascinated him like an intricate puzzle box. Elijah learned to read Braille music, his small fingers flying over the raised dots, absorbing sonatas and etudes at a speed that stunned Arthur. But he never played them straight. A Mozart piece would always end with a little run of Elijah's own, a musical wink, as if he was telling the old composer, "That was nice. Here's what I think, too." The bond between them deepened, a bridge built on a shared secret language. Arthur learned about Elijah's world, the specific click of the turnstile at the bus stop, the hum of the refrigerator that meant it was working hard, the different footsteps of neighbors in the hall. Elijah learned about Arthur's world of concert halls and practice rooms, a world that sounded grand, but also, to his ears, strangely lonely and echo-filled. One afternoon, Arthur was helping Elijah with a particularly tricky Chopin nocturne. The boy's fingers were mastering the notes, but the romantic, flowing emotion of it was elusive. "It's like silk," Arthur said, demonstrating a phrase. Smooth, flowing. Elijah felt Arthur's hands on the keys, trying to mimic the motion. "I don't know what silk feels like," he said quietly, not with sadness, just a simple statement of fact. Arthur stopped. The reality of Elijah's world hit him anew. He could describe colors and textures all day, but they were just words. He thought for a moment. Then he took Elijah's right hand and placed it gently on his own left wrist. "Play the phrase," he said. Elijah played it, still mechanically. "Now," Arthur said, and he began to conduct Elijah's wrist with a gentle, swaying motion as he played, guiding the rhythm not by count, but by a physical, wave-like pulse. "It's not in your fingers yet. It's here." He moved Elijah's arm. "It's a sway, like the bus when it goes around a slow corner." Understanding dawned on Elijah's face. He played the phrase again, his arm moving with the new swaying pulse Arthur guided. The notes suddenly melted into one another, becoming liquid and beautiful. The silk was in the motion, not the description. When they finished, Elijah was beaming. Arthur felt a pride warmer than any standing ovation. But the moment also cast a shadow. This was the heart of the question that had begun to gnaw at both of them, and at Elijah's grandmother, who watched it all with loving, wary eyes. What was this gift for? One evening, after a lesson, Arthur broached the subject with Elijah's grandmother as she made tea in her small kitchen. "He's ready for more," Arthur said, his voice low. "There are schools, special programs for the visually impaired, with incredible music departments. He could have the best teachers in the world." She stirred the tea, the spoon clinking softly against the mug. "And then what?" she asked, not looking at him. "And then, the world hears him. He could perform. He could compose. He could share what he has." "Share," she repeated the word thoughtfully. "Or be chewed up. You and I both know that world, Mr. Leyland. It's full of people who see a blind black boy who can play and think of one thing. A story. A miracle. They'll put him on stages and pat themselves on the back for finding him. They'll call him Inspirational, but will they let him just be a musician? Or will he always be the blind musician first? Arthur had no answer. He had seen it himself. The labels that stuck, that reduced a person to a single, sensational trait. He's happy here, she continued, her voice firm but not unkind. He has his music, his home, his friend, you. She said the last word pointedly. That's a real thing you've built. Is the stage worth risking that? Would it make his music better? Or just louder? Later, Arthur asked Elijah a version of the same question. They were sitting at the community center piano, the evening sun throwing long shadows. Eli, Arthur began, do you ever think about playing your music for a lot of people? In a big theater, with hundreds listening? Elijah considered it. Would they be quiet? He asked. Arthur smiled. They would try. But it's a different kind of quiet. It's a waiting quiet. They'd be waiting for you to be amazing. Elijah's nose scrunched up. I don't like that. When Mrs. Jenkins holds her breath when I play here, it makes me want to stop. The best quiet is when people forget to listen and just hear. Like you do when you're washing dishes and music is on the radio. Arthur's heart ached. The boy had just described the purest form of artistic connection, one that he, with all his training, struggled to achieve. What about making a recording? Arthur tried another angle. So people could hear your fire escape rain or your bus ride song. This interested Elijah more. Like on the radio? So someone like me, somewhere else, could hear it? Yes, exactly. And they could just listen in their kitchen? Elijah asked. They could. Elijah nodded slowly. That sounds okay. As long as nobody asks me to play the rain on command. He said it with a sly smile, and Arthur laughed. The question remained unresolved, a quiet tension. Arthur's own concert was approaching, and he found himself torn. He had begun secretly to compose again. Little snippets of music inspired by his time with Elijah, a piece built on the rhythm of a turning bus, another that tried to capture the feeling of a shared secret. It was messy, emotional, and utterly alive. It was also completely unlike the complex, austere modern pieces he was scheduled to perform the week before the concert. During a Saturday session, Arthur played one of these new, raw little compositions for Elijah. It was short, just a minute long, full of unresolved questions and warm, curious chords. When he finished, Elijah was silent for a long time. Then he said, "That's you. What do you mean?" Arthur asked. "The other music you play is like you're wearing a very expensive stiff coat. This is you in your sweater. The one with the hole in the elbow you think I don't know about. This music is you." Arthur looked down at the frayed elbow of his sweater. He felt exposed and seen in a way that was terrifying and wonderful. The gift was not just Elijah's music. The gift was Elijah himself, a mirror that showed Arthur not the celebrated pianist, but the man who lived inside, who was scared and lonely, and had just started to remember how to play for the joy of it. The path forward was still unclear. But Arthur knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that whatever happened, his role was no longer to shape Elijah for the world. It was to protect the unique, beautiful voice of the boy, and to learn from it, whether the audience was a concert hall of thousands or a quiet kitchen of two. The real performance, he was starting to understand, had already begun. The concert hall was a universe away from the community center. Arthur Leyland stood in the wings, the heavy velvet curtain a dark wall beside him. He could hear the murmur of the audience, a low, expectant hum. He was dressed in his usual performance suit, crisp and black, but his fingers felt cold. For the first time in his career, the thought of walking out into that bright silence filled him not with excitement, but with a hollow dread. The complex, thorny piece he was about to play felt like a foreign language. His mind was back in the small apartment, at the electric keyboard. He saw Elijah's face, lit with a smile as he played his sweater music. He heard the boy's grandmother's question, sharp and true. Asterisk, would it make his music better or just louder? Asterisk, he took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The applause washed over him and faded into that waiting quiet Elijah had described. He sat at the grand piano, a magnificent instrument that gleamed under the lights. He placed his hands on the keys, and for the next 50 minutes, Arthur Leyland gave a technically perfect performance. Every note was precise, every dynamic shift executed with control. The critics in the audience would later call it masterful. But as he played, Arthur felt like a ghost in his own body. He was delivering a lecture, not telling a story. The music was impressive, but it had no heartbeat. He took his bows, smiled the practiced smile, and left the stage. The applause felt like rain on a distant roof. In his dressing room, he slowly unknotted his tie. He felt empty. The question that had haunted him for weeks now shouted in the silence. Asterisk, what was it all for? Asterisk, the next day, he drove to the neighborhood. He didn't go to the community center. He went to the apartment. Elijah's grandmother let him in, reading the fatigue on his face. Tough night? She asked. It was. Successful, Arthur said, the word tasting like dust. Elijah was on the sofa, his face turned toward Arthur. Did you play your sweater music? He asked, hope in his voice. Arthur's heart cracked a little. No, Eli, I played the stiff coat music. Oh, Elijah said, his face falling just a touch. Then he perked up. Can we play now? They sat at the keyboard. Arthur, still weary from the performance, began to play one of the sterile pieces from his concert. Halfway through, his hands just stopped. He couldn't do it. He let his fingers fall into a simple, slow chord progression, something warm and open. He wasn't thinking, just feeling. Elijah, who had been listening quietly, shifted on the bench. Can I? He whispered. Arthur slid over. Please. Elijah's hands found the keys. He listened to Arthur's simple chords for a moment, then began to weave a melody above them. It wasn't fireworks. It was a conversation. A question from Arthur's left hand, an answer from Elijah's right. A statement from the bass, a reflection from the treble. They built something together, right there in the quiet living room, with the grandmother listening from her chair, her knitting needles still. When they finished, Arthur felt more alive than he had on the concert stage. He knew what he had to do. A week later, he made the arrangements. It wasn't a concert hall. It was the community room of Elijah's grandmother's church, a simple space with folding chairs, stained glass windows, and a well-loved upright piano that was only slightly better than the one at the center. The audience was small. Elijah's grandmother, a few neighbors, Mrs. Jenkins from the community center, and 3 people Arthur had invited, a retired music professor he trusted, a local composer, and the head of a small, respected arts nonprofit that focused on grassroots talent. There were no programs, no tickets. Elijah wore his best clothes, a neat button-up shirt and slacks. He was nervous, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Arthur sat next to him on the front row. Just play for them like you play for me, Arthur whispered. Forget they're there. Play the room. Play the afternoon light. Play whatever you feel. Elijah nodded, his throat tight. When it was time, Arthur walked to the piano first. He addressed the small gathering, his voice humble. Thank you for coming. Music finds us in strange ways. It found me again through a remarkable young man. Tonight isn't about me. It's about listening. Truly listening. He played a short piece. It was the sweater music he had written, the one inspired by the bus ride with Elijah. It was flawed, emotional, and completely honest. When he finished, the applause was warm. He then turned and held out his hand. Elijah. The boy stood. He walked the familiar steps to the piano, his hand brushing the back of a chair to guide him. He sat on the bench, adjusted himself, and let his hands rest in his lap for a long moment, listening to the settling quiet of the room. This quiet felt different. It was the quiet of friends waiting, not critics judging that he began with the Chopin nocturne Arthur had taught him. He played it beautifully, the silk-like flow now natural in his wrists. But then, as was his way, he didn't stop at the final note. He let it fade, and then began a gentle, improvisational transition, turning the romantic 19th century piece into something softer, more personal. It melted into his own Fire Escape Rain composition. The small audience sat utterly still, captivated. They weren't just hearing skill. They were being shown a world. He played for 20 minutes, a blend of learned classics and his own sonic paintings. He finished with the blues scale he had played that very first day for Arthur, but now it was deeper, richer, a story told by a wiser voice. The room erupted in genuine, heartfelt applause. Elijah, flushed with relief and happiness, gave a small bow of his head. Arthur returned to the piano and sat beside him on the bench. He looked at the boy, then at the small, attentive crowd. Elijah has one more piece, Arthur said. A new one. We'll play it together. He looked at Elijah, who gave a tiny, confident nod. Arthur began with a slow walking bass line in the lower keys, a steady, rhythmic pattern that was unmistakably the tap of Arthur's own cane on the sidewalk. Elisha listened, a smile touching his lips. Then his right hand entered, playing a bright, curious melody above it, the sound of a boy, listening, questioning. What unfolded was a conversation in music. Arthur's part was structured, a bit hesitant, full of space. Elijah's responses were fluid, unexpected, filling those spaces with light. You could hear the story in the notes. The stern teacher, the shy student, the first moments of trust, the shared laughter, the moments of frustration and breakthrough. The music argued, agreed, wondered, and celebrated. It wasn't a perfect duet by classical standards. Sometimes they stepped on each other's musical lines. But it sounded like people talking, interrupting, understanding. They built to a gentle climax, not loud, but full a harmonious blending of both their themes into something entirely new. A third voice that belonged to neither alone, but to their friendship. The final notes were a series of quiet, resolved chords that hung in the sun-dappled air of the community room, leaving a feeling of profound peace. For a moment, there was no sound. Then, the small audience rose to their feet. There were no whistles, just warm, sustained clapping and a few wiped eyes. Elijah's grandmother beamed, her pride a physical force in the room. Afterward, the invited guests came up, not with business cards, but with quiet words. The composer said, "That wasn't a performance. That was a gift." The nonprofit director simply said, "Whenever he's ready, we have a studio where he can just record his world. No strings." Arthur watched as Elijah received the praise with shy grace, his hand firmly in his grandmother's. The path forward was still being drawn, but it was on their terms. It might be recordings. It might be small gatherings like this. It might just be the continual private joy of creation. The mind-blowing gift wasn't a ticket to stardom. It was a key that had unlocked 2 lives, one that had forgotten how to feel music, and one that was learning how to share his feelings with the world without losing himself. Later, as they helped fold the chairs, Elijah turned to Arthur. "The duet," he said. "That was the best music. Why?" Arthur asked, though he thought he knew. "Because it wasn't just me. And it wasn't just you," Elijah said, struggling to find the words. It was the end. It was us together. That's a new sound. Arthur put a hand on the boy's shoulder. He looked at Elijah's grandmother, who gave him a nod of quiet acknowledgement. The story wasn't about a discovery or a dramatic launch to fame. It was about a teacher and a student who had swapped roles until the roles disappeared, leaving only two friends at a piano, finding a new sound, one honest note at a time. The concert was over. The music, the real music, had just begun.